Okay, so we should be live. For people just randomly joining, Mementia is a small web development company that is implementing Holacracy. And this live stream is kind of our internal meeting where we just clarify certain things about how we do things. And hopefully this will be useful for other people as well that do Holacracy on a larger, smaller scale. The way this will work is I'm just going to address a couple of things that have popped up while working in Mementia. And I'll be happy to I'll be happy to address any other questions on the go if we have them. Okay, so I don't want to make this a long live stream. It's the first stream that we're doing on Holacracy anyway, so I want to make it quick. So let's get started. The first question, and I'm going to post these questions cards on the live stream as well. The first question here is backup partners, and this is of course something that needs a little bit of introduction, and I think it's a great point to address in Holacracy. So Holacracy doesn't talk about things like vacations and days off and sick leaves. Those are apps that people need to create or adopt, and then those apps are what actually makes it work. What Holacracy talks about is role assignment, and doesn't really talk about the fact that you may not be at work at a particular time or not. So in Mementia, what we did was we created kind of a small app that basically tries to regulate these things. And the way we do that is we have a kind of straightforward, simple vacation and sick leaves policy. And we also have what we call backup partners, which is basically a person replacing you when you're not around. So the problem there, so going to the question, the problem there is that this person needs to actually understand all the roles that they will inherit, right? In Holacracy terms, what we actually do is we assign both people to the role, and the other person has a focus of performing that role when the primary partner is not present. It is basically what it is. So people who handle those roles are not obliged under the Constitution to completely handle them, but they can be expected to do so, and they're accountable for that. So they can be requested to do certain things. How this works in practice, you can imagine how it works in practice. So if somebody doesn't really know things that the other person is doing, so if those things are not documented, it doesn't work so well. If things are documented and kept up to date, it will work just fine. So it's no different than just taking a project or even a next action from somebody else and just performing them. So there is nothing really specific for Holacracy or even our backup partners policy. It just means that you have to pay even more attention to making sure that things are up to date, all the information is there, and not count on yourself being available I don't know, in a week or in a month or so. You need to keep extensive notes. That's how it works. Okay, so I hope I've addressed that question. I would like to ask you guys to type the questions instead of saying them, because I can't really hear you well. If you have any other things that you want to add. Okay, so the next question is about the governance process in simple words, especially testing the objections. Okay, so the governance process is kind of straightforward in its philosophy. Holacracy is meant to encourage change. So it's much easier to propose than to object, and that is by design. the design being that we don't want people to obstruct the change process. Holacracy is very biased towards change, not to keeping the status quo. And that change should be incremental as well as a best practice. What this translates into is that you don't really have to be a lawyer to make a proposal, but you have to know things very well if you're going to object. And you have to have really good arguments to be able to object. So for proposals, it's enough to say, okay, this is a tension I see. This is what I would expect to see, and this is what I see. That is the tension. It's the simplest form possible. The expected result and the actual result, like a bug, right? Only in a business. And then you say, okay, and I think this is what we should change. So that can be a governance output. And that can be anything from creating a new role, modifying a role, creating a new policy for a circle domain, or creating a new domain, or even doing things which is more complex, doing things like changing the constitution or amending the constitution. You can do all those things with, if you know how. So proposals are kind of straightforward, but when you have to object, then things can get a little complicated. The objection, a valid objection is, if we just summarize, a valid objection would be anything that's harmful, anything that that you see will happen inevitably that will hurt the circle. So it will move the circle backwards, in other words. So basically, you think it's a bad idea, you see good reasons that it's a bad idea, and then by default, that objection will have to be addressed by the proposer, and then you two work together. So it's not meant to be a lawyering thing where, hey, okay, I don't want to talk to this guy that's making the proposal, here's my objection, and it's not meant to work like that. It's meant to be a collaborative thing. So the proposer and the objector, the proposer says, okay, yeah, I guess, I'm not sure, but yeah, I can see the problem you're talking about. Let's work together and let's amend the proposal so it'll be better. That's how it's meant to work. However, this is not enforced, so it doesn't have to work that way, and it can be a lawyering thing. And when it becomes a lawyering thing, a partner needs to request that, first of all, so a proposal can be tested by the facilitator on the governance meeting, and basically the proposal only has to address the tension, and it has to be valid in terms of not violating the Constitution. So if the proposal doesn't address the tension, then yeah, it doesn't make sense. So the facilitator is at liberty of doing this at any time. But objection can be tested as well if requested. And then objections are tested using a very rigorous process in the Constitution. There are multiple steps in that process. And let me just quickly find the appropriate section in the Constitution. So what we're looking here is testing objections. That's how you can find it, which is what I'm searching for right now. So what I'm reading right now is a section 3.2.4 in the Constitution version 4.1, which is what we're using in Mementia right now. And as you can see, there are criteria listed in A through E. E is a special criteria, and E basically means that this proposal would violate the Constitution, which is enough to make it a bad proposal. The other tests of the objection basically try to make sure that we're not guessing things, trying to predict the future before it happens, and that we actually have real-life examples of how things would be bad. So just quickly going through A through D. The first part, A, says that if the tension were unaddressed, the capacity of the circle to express its purpose or enact its accountabilities would degrade. Thus, the tension is not just triggered by a better idea or a potential for further improvement, but because the proposal would actually move the circle backwards in its current capacity. So that means that if we don't address the tension, and the tension being the objection, the capacity of the circle to express its purpose, so to fulfill its purpose, or to do its accountabilities would degrade. So it would make the whole circle's job harder, and that would actually degrade the outputs of that work. So this means that it's actually creating a problem for the circle. Clarifications are for the purpose of this criteria. Decreasing clarity in particular is counted as a degrading capacity. That means that even though it could be debated otherwise, if a proposal is decreasing clarity, that's bad under this particular test. Failing to improve clarity, however, is not. So if the proposal is not making things worse, it's fine. Please note that all of these items have to be met for a valid objection. So A through D or E, which would be the constitutional problem. So moving to B, the tension does not already exist for the circle, even in the absence of the proposal. In other words, are we solving a problem that we already have, that we already had, and the proposal didn't actually affect it? Or are we solving something that's actually related to the proposal? In other words, is the proposal creating the problem? If the problem has already existed before, then that's not a valid objection. We need to fix the problem, but that's not a good reason to object to the proposal. C says the tension is triggered just by presently known facts or events without regard to a prediction of what might happen in the future. There is a caveat here. However, relying on prediction is allowed when no opportunity to adequately sense and respond is likely to exist in the future before significant impact could result. So obviously, many risks would go into with this test. The idea here is that we don't try to predict future too much. So if we have time to react to a problem, then the objection is not valid. If we don't have time to react to the problem, to the hypothetical problem that we're talking about, then the objection is valid and we need to prepare for that. So if this is creating a problem and that problem will actually impact in a month from appearing, then we will have plenty of time to react, and we can react. And of course, the objector can make another proposal that adequately prepares us in advance if that's a good idea. But simply saying, hey, this might happen, if we have adequate time to respond with governance, then we're good, and it's not a valid objection. D, the tension limits the objector's capacity to express the purpose or an accountability of one of the objector's role in the circle, or if it limits another role, the objector has permission to represent that role from a circle member who normally fills the role. So this means that the tension is actually a problem for you. Okay, so you have to be impacted. One of your roles has to be impacted in order for the tension to be valid. You can't be a lawyer for somebody else unless that somebody else has given you explicit permission to do that. Normally, in holacracy, it's expected that we protect our roles and make sure that our roles don't have tensions, that we process any tensions that working in our roles creates. So this is exactly what it is. So lead link's role is a little bit special in terms of the accountabilities and in terms of what it does. So it carries the purpose of the circle with it. But all the other rules still apply. So you actually have to worry about your own problems, and every role should worry about their own problems. And then, as I talked about, E already, it means that it violates the Constitution in some way. So a non-valid governance output, NVGO, for example, would be a great thing. So something just declaratory, some dicta or something like that would not qualify as valid governance outputs. So you can't do that on governance. So unfortunately, I didn't address the actual request that this would be in simple words. I don't think it's simple at all. I think objections are objectively complicated, and that is by design. Objections should be hard. And if you're not sure about the objection, there can still be a goodwill from the proposer and the facilitator to actually integrate that objection. It's just not mandated. Usually, if you're not sure about how to formulate the objection properly and how to pass all the tests, you can count on actually making the proposal that will put you in a much better position than defending an objection. So just to go quickly through the test criteria. Okay, so the first one tests what if we do nothing. Okay, A means if we do nothing, would it hurt the circle? And the answer should be yes. So if we do something, it will be okay. If we don't do anything, it won't. B, is this already there? And maybe the proposal doesn't have anything to do with it. Okay. And the answer to that should be no, the proposal is creating the problem. C, are we trying to guess the future? If so, will we have time to react to the problem? And the answer should be no, or yes, but we won't have time to react. And then D, is this actually making it harder for you to do your job? So is it actually a problem for you in your roles? And the answer should be yes. The facilitator is testing the objections using these criteria. So examples should be provided. Specific examples should be provided when you're being tested by the facilitator for all of these. Again, the exception E is again violating the Constitution. That one doesn't require anything else, so it's good on its own. If you can show that the proposal is violating the Constitution, that's a valid objection automatically. So anyone can request a test of the objections, and the facilitator can also decide to do it herself or himself. It's not mandatory. So this process can be skipped, right? I can, as a facilitator, I can say, okay, this makes sense. It might not be perfect, but yeah, okay, let's talk about that problem that you have outlined, and then we can skip the whole testing thing. So testing is relatively rarely used in my experience and my understanding of how it's supposed to be used. Okay. So the last question I have on the list for the no, actually, I have two more. Okay, so what will happen when some role gets a new accountability that partner doesn't know how to do or doesn't want to be accountable for that process activity? Okay, so what happens when some role gets a new accountability and I don't want to do that? Okay, so that's a great question. There are ways that this can happen, but a role getting a new accountability happens only through governance, pretty much. There is no other way, right? The only other thing would be circle accountabilities, and those are assigned by lead link. But I think we're not talking about that. We're talking about simply adding an accountability for an existing role. And so, okay, I'm in that role, and somebody wants to add an accountability that I don't like. Let's say it's talking to people, and I hate people. I don't want to talk to people. Okay, and Since I don't want to talk to people, somebody decides that it's a good idea to add an explicit expectations that, yeah, you have to talk to people in order to do that job. Okay. So then I have several options. First of all, I can object. I would have to formulate that objection well, so that it doesn't simply get discarded. But again, if people are willing to work with me, there's a chance that the proposer will, do something like create another role that has to talk, and then this role doesn't have to talk. Or I can also, suggest changes to the proposal in the reactions part of the governance, which would basically make it non-mandatory, but I would still be heard. Right? So let's assume that I'm a project manager that doesn't like people. That's not a good combination, but okay. Doesn't like talking to people. You don't have to actually like people to be a project manager. Actually, it helps to be the opposite. So let's assume I don't like to talk, and I have the accountability that I have to talk or call people or whatever. So what I would do is I would say, well, I would tell the truth. I would say, hey, this will make it harder for me to do my job, and then by proxy, it would make the circle degrade because I would be doing my job in a worse way. And then there are several ways this can go depending on the specifics. This can be separated. So the idea of holacracy would be to do what you like to do and not do things you don't like to do unless there's nobody else to do them, and then that should be done in a fair way. So one would create a role, and then we would recruit somebody who likes people to that role and get somebody else to do it, or simply reassign somebody else. That would be one way of doing this. Another way of doing this would be to suggest a proposal that would modify this. So even if you choose not to object, you could come up with a proposal that, let's say, removes this accountability, and then you would be the proposer and somebody else would have to defend the position that, yeah, we should keep the status quo because it's better for the circle. It's a stronger position by default. You can also suggest changes to that particular accountability, and it can also be that a separate interpretation of that accountability might not be what you think it is. So you can ask the secretary to interpret it. So I would say that governance would be the answer in all of these things. As you can see, there's nothing you can do once you're assigned to the role. You're expected to do that role, and you're expected to do all those things. If you don't want to do them, you can't quit accountabilities one by one. You have to resign from the role. So and that's fine because you can actually do that. Okay, I can see one additional question in the chat, but I'm gonna move forward. If I didn't address this question in a good way, then please let me know and I can circle back to it. Okay. Okay, so the last question on my list here, when can we take individual action and how to do that properly? Okay, that's a great question. Individual action basically means that something is very wrong. Individual action is section 4.3. If we talk about it in a very simple way, individual action means that the rules are so bad that you don't have time to fix them. You have to do something quickly, and you have to break the rules. And that's okay. You can break any rules. However, you then have the duty to clean up after yourself. So you have to actually fix the problem. You can't just break the rules and not fix the problem. You have to fix the problem. Section 4.3 describes how to do that. So you just break the rules, step one. Step two, you have to record the tension and you have to address it. It's your job to then address it directly through governance or other means, but you have to prevent instances of this happening in the future. So that's just if we're going for a simple explanation. The actual details are in section 4.3. It's a relatively detailed thing. Breaking the rules is not always allowed. 4.3.1 lists the situations that you can actually break the rule, and there are 4 criteria. The first criteria will be acting in good faith to serve the purpose or express the accountability of some role within the organization or the overall organization. So you're protecting the roles or circle's interests. B, you think this will be better than, so it will create less problems. It would cause less problems than it tries to solve. So if your action is creating more problems, then you're not allowed to do that, even under individual action. Your action would not cause C, commit to or allow spending on otherwise disposing organizations' resources or other assets beyond what you're already authorized to spend. So you can't spend financial or other resources under individual action. You're not allowed to do that. Except if you are, right? If there's a policy or anything allowing you to spend resources as well, yeah, you can spend the resources as well. And then if your action would violate any domains or policies, you reasonably believe that you can delay the action long enough to request any permissions normally required, or to propose a governance change to allow your action without losing much of its potential value. So let's say it's late at night, I don't know, the website is down, you don't have the authority to touch the website, but you can actually fix it. You go and fix it. You can't reach anybody else to ask for permission. You try calling people are at sleep, you go and fix the site. And then, of course, you suggest something that will prevent that from happening in the future. So maybe, if you can fix the site, maybe somebody has to give you permission to do that in case of emergencies. And that would be a good scenario and good example for this particular thing, for individual action. If I'm not allowed to touch the website by policies without asking for permission, I can't ask for permission because nobody's there, and I can't wait because the site is down, then yeah, I would have to take action and then clean up afterwards. Okay. There's a follow-up question on the previous question, when I don't want to do something. And the question is, wouldn't the first way lead to hiring thousands of people who work part-time or on what they like? How would it actually work in a small company? That's a great question. We actually have what we call a vendors policy and a recruitment policy in Mementia. So we can actually hire outside people, we can outsource things. I don't see a problem with outsourcing things you don't like, as long as you're still accountable for those things. So that's a great way to fix what we talked about. You simply don't want to do one accountability. You can outsource that to somebody else, as long as you're still accountable for that. If you don't want to be accountable, then that will not work because they're not partners and they're not assigned to the role. The other potential that I mentioned is that we actually hire somebody. They're a partner, they're assigned to the role, but they're doing just this one small thing. Obviously, that's not realistic even in large companies. Nobody wants to pay people for doing nothing or for doing one small thing sometimes, right? And people usually like to be paid a salary and so on. The answer to that is, unfortunately, that sometimes we have to do things we don't like. And we just need to make sure that it's fair and that everybody is equally represented in that, and that everybody's doing at least mostly what they like to do. So we all have different personalities, we all have different preferences, and in any given set of people, you can distribute the roles optimally or less optimally. So using the crutches of outsourcing and using reusing part-time employees and things like that, you can address this, I think, in a reasonable way. And then role reassignment focuses and things like that can also help. But you can't just ignore an accountability, that's for sure. If you think it should be a separate role, and there is nobody to assign that role to, then you haven't really fixed the problem by saying, yeah, I don't wanna do this. Sometimes it's a package deal. Okay, so 70% of the time you do things you like, 30% of the time you have to eat your vegetables. So sometimes it's like that. Okay, so unless you guys have some other questions that I don't see here, and I don't see anything in chat, I would like to then thank you for attending, and hopefully you'll have more questions and we can talk a bit more, maybe involve you guys as well. So this will be a little more dynamic than just a talking head talking about holacracy. Thank you very much, and looking forward to next time.